My name is Charlotte Miller, and at 62 years old, I thought I'd seen everything life could throw at me. After 35 years serving coffee and apple pie at Danny's Diner, I believed I knew exactly how people saw me. Just another waitress in a worn uniform, invisible to most unworthy of respect to others. But sometimes life has a way of proving you wrong in the most spectacular fashion. As I stood in that elegant country club, watching my daughter Emily walk down the aisle, I had no idea that in just a few hours, my son-in-law would humiliate me in front of 200 wedding guests. And I certainly never imagined that a television screen would change everything forever. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already, because trust me, you're about to hear a story about how sometimes people have no idea who they're really talking to. Let me paint you a picture of my life before that wedding day. For 35 years, I'd been Charlotte the waitress. Every morning at 5:30, I'd tie my hair back pin on my name tag and walk through the doors of Danny's Diner on Maple Street. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and it had put food on the table and clothes on my daughter's back after my husband Robert died in a construction accident when Emily was just 10 years old. Those early years were the hardest. I'd work double shifts whenever I could, coming home with aching feet and grease stains on my uniform, only to help Emily with her homework and make sure she had everything she needed. The other waitresses at Danny's became my family. There was Martha, who'd been there longer than anyone and taught me how to balance 4 plates on one arm, and young Sarah, fresh out of high school, who reminded me so much of Emily at that age. The customers ranged from construction workers grabbing breakfast before dawn to business people stopping in for quick lunches. Most were decent folk, treating me with basic courtesy. Some even became friends over the years, asking about Emily's school plays or graduation. But there were always those who looked right through me as if I were part of the furniture, or worse, made comments about just a waitress when they thought I couldn't hear. I watched Emily grow up in the booths of that diner, doing her homework while I finished my shifts. She was brilliant, getting straight A's and earning a full scholarship to State University. I was so proud when she graduated with her business degree, and even prouder when she landed a job at a prestigious marketing firm downtown. That's where she met Brad Richardson. Brad came from old money, the kind of family that had been wealthy for generations. His father owned several law firms across the state, and Brad himself was a successful corporate attorney. When Emily first brought him home, I tried my best to make a good impression. I cooked her favorite pot roast, set the table with my good dishes, and wore my nicest dress. But from the moment Brad walked into my modest apartment, I could see the judgment in his eyes. He barely acknowledged my existence, answering my questions with one-word responses and checking his phone constantly throughout dinner. When I mentioned that I'd love to have them visit me at the diner sometime, he actually laughed and said, "I don't think that environment would be appropriate for us." Over the months that followed, things only got worse. Brad never called me by name, always referring to me as Emily's mother, or when he thought I couldn't hear, the waitress mom. When they'd visit, he'd sit stiffly on my couch, as if he might catch something, and he'd steer conversations toward topics I supposedly wouldn't understand, like stock markets and property investments. The worst part was watching Emily change. My confident, loving daughter began making excuses for why they couldn't visit more often. She'd suggest we meet at restaurants, instead of my home, always places where Brad felt comfortable. Slowly but surely, I felt my daughter slipping away from me, drawn into a world where I didn't belong. When Emily announced their engagement, I was thrilled for her happiness, but terrified about the wedding planning process. The Richardson family immediately took control, insisting on their country club, their caterer, their florist. Everything had to meet their standards, which it was made clear were considerably higher than mine. The Riverside Country Club was the kind of place I'd only seen in movies. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings of fox hunts adorning the walls. The membership fees alone probably cost more than I made in 6 months. When Emily and I went for the venue tour, I felt completely out of place in my department store dress, while Patricia Richardson, Brad's mother, glided through in her designer suit, discussing table arrangements and wine selections with the ease of someone who'd done this many times before. Patricia was polite but cold, the kind of politeness that somehow made you feel smaller than outright rudeness would have. She had a way of asking questions that sounded caring, but were actually designed to highlight our differences. "Charlotte, dear, have you given any thought to what you'll wear? I know this isn't the sort of event you're used to attending." Or, "I hope you won't feel too overwhelmed by the guest list. Most of them move in rather exclusive circles." I spent weeks looking for an appropriate dress, finally settling on a navy blue outfit from Macy's that cost me nearly a month's tips, but still looked plain compared to what I knew the other guests would be wearing. I practiced walking in heels I rarely wore and rehearsed conversations in my head, trying to prepare for the social challenges ahead. Emily was caught in the middle, and I could see the stress wearing on her. She'd tried to include me in planning decisions, but the Richardsons had strong opinions about everything. When I suggested some budget-friendly options for the flowers, Patricia gently but firmly explained that they had certain standards to maintain. When I offered to help with any costs, Brad actually patted my shoulder condescendingly and said, "That's very sweet, but this is a bit out of your league." The guest list was another source of anxiety. Nearly 200 people, most of whom I'd never met. Lawyers, doctors, business owners, and their wives, who probably spent more on handbags than I made in a year. Emily assured me that several of my friends from the diner were invited, but when the time came, most felt too intimidated to attend. Only Martha and Sarah ended up coming, and even they seemed nervous about fitting in. During the rehearsal dinner, I sat at a table with Emily's college friends, trying to follow conversations about European vacations and investment properties. They were polite, but clearly puzzled about what to say to me. One young woman asked if I enjoyed the service industry, as if waitressing was some sort of hobby I'd picked up. Another suggested I must have so many interesting stories from the diner, but when I started to share one, I could see their attention drifting. The rehearsal itself went smoothly, but I noticed how naturally Emily fit into the Richardson family dynamics. She laughed at Patricia's insider jokes and seamlessly joined conversations about people and places I'd never heard of. Watching her, I felt proud, but also deeply sad. My little girl had grown into a sophisticated woman who belonged in this world in a way I never would. The wedding morning arrived grey and drizzly, though the weather cleared by afternoon. I spent hours getting ready in my hotel room, a modest accommodation I'd insisted on paying for myself rather than accepting the Richardsons' offer to cover my stay in their guest house. I needed space to breathe, to prepare myself mentally for what I knew would be a challenging day. The ceremony was beautiful, I'll give them that. Emily looked radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace gown, a Richardson family heirloom that probably cost more than my car. Walking down that long aisle lined with white roses and baby's breath, she looked like she belonged in a fairy tale. I tried to focus on her happiness rather than the fact that I was sitting alone in the family section while the Richardson side overflowed with relatives and family friends. During the vows, I found myself crying, but not entirely from joy. Don't get me wrong, I was happy for Emily, but I was also mourning the end of something. The little girl who used to sit in my diner booth coloring on napkins while I worked was now a woman who could afford to forget where she came from. The reception began immediately after the ceremony held in the club's grand ballroom. Round tables covered in ivory linens were topped with elaborate centerpieces of orchids and roses. The lighting was soft and romantic, and a string quartet played classical music I didn't recognize, but found soothing. It should have been magical, and in many ways it was, but I felt like an observer rather than a participant. I was seated at a table near the back with some of Emily's distant relatives and family friends. The conversation flowed around topics I couldn't contribute to: private schools, yacht clubs, and charity galas. When someone did address me directly, it was usually with the kind of careful politeness reserved for children or people with limited understanding. They spoke slowly and chose simple words, as if my job serving coffee somehow indicated limited intelligence. Martha and Sarah found me during cocktail hour, and their presence was a relief. We stood together near the bar, watching the elegant crowd and marveling at the opulence. But even my loyal friends seemed subdued, intimidated by the grandeur and the obvious wealth surrounding us. We were three working women in a sea of privilege, trying not to touch anything expensive or speak too loudly. Emily was radiant, moving from table to table with Brad, accepting congratulations and posing for photos. She looked perfectly at home, laughing at jokes I couldn't hear, and embracing people with genuine warmth. When she reached our table, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Thank you for everything, Mom. I love you so much." But the moment was brief, and duty called her away to greet more important guests. As the evening progressed, I found myself retreating further into the background. The conversations around me grew more animated as people drank and relaxed, but I felt increasingly isolated. I watched from my corner table as the Richardson family held court, telling stories and sharing memories that didn't include me. Patricia was in her element, gracious and charming, every inch the perfect mother of the groom. The trouble began when Brad stood up to give his speech. By then, he'd had several glasses of champagne, and his usual careful politeness had given way to a looser, more careless demeanor. The room quieted as he tapped his glass with a silver spoon, calling for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate Emily and me." He began, his voice slightly slurred, but still confident. The crowd responded with warm applause and encouraging murmurs. He continued with the expected remarks about love commitment and the future, drawing more applause and a few emotional sighs from the female guests. But then his tone shifted, becoming more casual, more conversational. "You know, Emily and I come from very different backgrounds," he said with a chuckle that made my stomach clench. "I mean, look around this room. We've got judges, senators, business leaders, people who really make a difference in this world." The crowd nodded approvingly, clearly comfortable with this assessment of their own importance. Brad gestured grandly around the room, his confidence growing with their positive response. "And then," he continued, his voice taking on an amused tone that made me want to disappear, "we have Emily's side of the family. Now, don't get me wrong, they're nice people, but let's be honest about who we're dealing with here." My heart began pounding as I realized where this was heading. Several guests turned to look in my direction, some with curious expressions, others already smiling in anticipation of whatever joke Brad was building up to. "Take Emily's mother, for instance," Brad said, pointing directly at me with his champagne glass. "Charlotte Miller, everyone. She's been serving coffee and pie at some downtown diner for 35 years now. That's dedication to the service industry right there." A few people clapped politely, unsure whether this was meant to be complimentary or not. But Brad wasn't finished. His grin widened as he warmed to his theme. "I mean, she's just a waitress at some greasy spoon called Danny's Diner. You've probably driven past it without noticing. Not exactly the kind of establishment any of us would frequent, if you know what I mean." Several guests chuckled at this, though some looked uncomfortable with the direction of his remarks. "The funny thing is," Brad continued, emboldened by the laughter, "she actually thinks she can contribute to our business discussions. Last week she tried to give me advice about contract negotiations. Can you imagine a waitress trying to explain legal strategy to a Harvard-educated attorney?" The laughter was louder now, though I could see some guests shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Emily's face had gone pale, but she was smiling that tight, frozen smile people wear when they're mortified but trying to hide it. "Don't worry, though," Brad announced with exaggerated reassurance. She won't understand most of our conversations anyway. I mean, what would someone who spent her entire life pouring coffee know about real business or professional success? It's probably best if we just include her in the simple stuff, like discussing the weather or asking how the food tastes. The room erupted in laughter at this, though it was the kind of laughter that felt more like a release of social tension than genuine amusement. Some people were laughing because everyone else was others, because they genuinely found his cruelty entertaining. A few I noticed weren't laughing at all, but looking down at their plates with obvious discomfort. I sat frozen in my chair, every word hitting me like a physical blow. This was my daughter's wedding, surrounded by 200 of their closest friends and family members, and my son-in-law was systematically destroying my dignity for entertainment. The worst part was seeing Emily's reaction, or lack thereof. Instead of defending me, she was nodding along and even giggling at some of Brad's crueler observations. "So here's to Emily," Brad concluded, raising his glass high, "for having the grace and intelligence to rise above her humble beginnings and become the sophisticated woman she is today. And here's to all of us, for welcoming her into a world where she truly belongs." The applause was thunderous, and I watched through blurred vision as people stood to toast my daughter and her new husband. Emily was beaming now, apparently relieved that the speech was over, and that she'd been praised rather than mocked. She never once looked in my direction to see how I was handling her husband's public humiliation of her mother. The universe, as it turns out, has a sense of timing that even Hollywood would envy. Just as Brad was basking in the aftermath of his cruel speech, just as the laughter was dying down and people were settling back into their conversations, the large television screens mounted around the ballroom suddenly flickered to life. The club's management had planned to show a slideshow of Emily and Brad's engagement photos during dessert, but instead the screens were displaying breaking news from the local affiliate. At first, the guests paid little attention. The volume was low, and most people were too engaged in their own conversations to notice the screens. But then someone at the table nearest to the largest screen stood up and pointed, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. "Oh my goodness, isn't that the waitress?" Suddenly, every eye in the room turned toward the screens, where a very familiar face was being interviewed by a serious-looking news anchor. It was me, Charlotte Miller, but not the Charlotte Miller these people had just watched being humiliated. This Charlotte Miller was wearing a sharp business suit, speaking with confidence and authority about a major legal victory. And tonight, we're here with Charlotte Miller, the lead advocate who secured this landmark settlement against the Pinnacle Restaurant Group, the anchor was saying. "Ms. Miller, can you tell us about the 3-year legal battle that led to this $28 million settlement for workers' rights violations?" The room fell completely silent, except for the sound of my own voice coming from the speakers. Even the string quartet stopped playing as everyone strained to listen. "Thank you, David," I heard myself saying on the screen, clear and articulate. This case represents more than just financial compensation for the affected workers. It establishes important precedents for fair wage practices, safe working conditions, and the right of service industry employees to organize for better treatment. The camera pulled back to show the full chyron at the bottom of the screen: Charlotte Miller, legal advocate and founder Workers' Rights Coalition. The silence in the ballroom was so complete, you could have heard a pin drop on the marble floor. 200 of the most influential people in the city sat transfixed, watching the woman they'd just witnessed, being mocked, reveal herself as something entirely different from what they'd assumed. "Ms. Miller," the anchor continued, "you've been working in the service industry yourself for over 3 decades while building your legal career. What drives your passion for workers' rights?" Every worker deserves dignity regardless of their job title. I heard myself explaining on screen. I've spent 35 years as a waitress at Danny's Diner, not because I had to, but because it keeps me connected to the community I serve. You can't effectively advocate for people if you don't understand their daily struggles. I watched the faces around me transform as this information sank in. Brad's expression had gone from smug satisfaction to pale shock. His mouth was literally hanging open as he stared at the screen, apparently unable to process what he was seeing and hearing. This settlement will fund educational scholarships for service industry workers and their children, my televised self continued, as well as establishing a legal aid clinic specifically for employment rights cases. But perhaps most importantly, it sends a message that no worker should be treated as disposable or unworthy of basic respect. The anchor nodded approvingly. And Ms. Miller, we understand you'll be donating your entire legal fee from this case estimated at over $2 million to the scholarship fund. That's an incredible act of generosity. Money was never the motivation, I responded on screen. Justice was, and ensuring that other working people have the opportunities and respect they deserve. Patricia Richardson, who had spent the entire evening treating me like an amusing curiosity, was staring at the screen with her mouth slightly agape. The other guests was turning to look at me, then back at the screen, then at me again, as if trying to reconcile the two versions of Charlotte Miller they were witnessing. But the revelations weren't over. The news segment continued with footage from the courthouse steps, where I was surrounded by dozens of restaurant workers, union representatives, and other attorneys. The reporter's voiceover explained that this was the largest settlement of its kind in state history, and that I had been working on the case for nearly 4 years while maintaining my job at the diner. Ms. Miller earned her law degree through night classes while working full-time, the anchor explained, and has been quietly building a reputation as one of the most effective labor rights advocates in the region. The camera showed me shaking hands with the governor, who had apparently issued a statement praising the settlement. Then it cut to testimonials from workers whose lives had been changed by the case. People talking about wage theft, dangerous working conditions, and intimidation tactics they'd endured before finding the courage to speak out. Charlotte Miller didn't just win us money, one woman said tearfully. She gave us back our dignity. As the news segment ended and the screens faded to black, I found myself in a room full of 200 people who were seeing me clearly for the first time. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before I slowly stood up from my table. Every eye in the room followed me as I walked calmly to the front of the ballroom, my low heels clicking softly against the marble floor. When I reached the microphone that Brad had used for his speech, I paused for a moment, looking out at all those faces that had been laughing at me just minutes earlier. "Good evening," I began, my voice steady and clear. "I believe some introductions are in order." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd, but most people simply stared, waiting to see how I would handle this moment. "My name is Charlotte Miller, and I am indeed a waitress at Danny's Diner, as my son-in-law so eloquently pointed out. I've been serving coffee and apple pie there for 35 years, and I'm proud of every single day of honest work I've done." I let that sink in before continuing. What Brad failed to mention in his charming speech is that I'm also an attorney specializing in labor rights, a published researcher on employment law, and as you just saw, someone who's dedicated her life to fighting for people who often don't have a voice in rooms like this one. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I could see Brad sinking lower in his chair, his face flushed with embarrassment and what might have been anger. I kept my diner job not because I had to, but because it reminded me every day why my legal work matters. Every morning when I tied on that apron, I was reminded that honest work has dignity, regardless of how much it pays or how much education it requires. Every customer I served taught me something about the real struggles working people face. I turned slightly to look at Emily, whose eyes were wide with shock, and something that might have been dawning respect or horror, I couldn't tell which. The settlement you just heard about represents 4 years of 18-hour days, countless nights in law libraries, and weekend depositions squeezed between double shifts at the diner. It represents justice for over 300 workers who were cheated, intimidated, and dismissed by people who thought their positions made them untouchable. Now I look directly at Brad, who was staring at his hands and refusing to meet my gaze. The $2 million in legal fees I'm donating will fund scholarships for working-class students who want to pursue higher education while supporting their families. Kids who might be told they're just something when they're actually capable of extraordinary things if given the opportunity. The applause started slowly, just a few people clapping, but it built steadily as more guests joined in. Soon nearly everyone in the room was applauding, some even standing. I noticed that several people were wiping their eyes, and a few were looking at Brad with expressions that ranged from disappointment to outright disgust. I want to thank everyone here tonight for reminding me of an important lesson. I continued as the applause died down. Never assume you know someone's worth based on their job title, their clothes, or their address. Every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about and possessing strengths you can't imagine. I looked around the room one more time, making eye contact with as many people as possible. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. Emily, darling, you looked beautiful today, and I wish you every happiness in your marriage. I paused, then added with a slight smile. And Brad, thank you for the reminder about why my work matters. Enjoy the rest of the reception. With that, I walked off the makeshift stage and headed toward the exit. Several guests tried to approach me as I passed their tables, some attempting to apologize for their earlier behavior, others wanting to congratulate me on the legal victory. But I kept moving, maintaining my dignity and composure, even as my heart was breaking. Martha and Sarah caught up with me in the lobby, both of them beaming with pride and righteous anger on my behalf. "Charlotte," Martha said, grabbing my arm, "that was the most magnificent thing I've ever seen. You showed them exactly who you are." I hugged them both tightly, grateful for their unwavering support. As we walked toward the parking lot, I could hear the reception continuing behind us, but somehow I doubted the celebration would have quite the same energy as before. That was 6 months ago, and I'm happy to say that life has taken some wonderful turns since then. The news coverage of both the settlement and the wedding incident, which someone apparently recorded and posted online, led to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities I never could have imagined. I've been invited to testify before the state legislature about workers' rights legislation, and 3 law schools have asked me to guest lecture about combining advocacy with lived experience. The scholarship fund is already supporting 15 students, including 2 young people from families I know through the diner. Watching them pursue their dreams while working to support their families reminds me every day why I made the choices I did. My relationship with Emily has been complicated, but ultimately healing. 3 weeks after the wedding, she showed up at my apartment with tears in her eyes and a genuine apology. She admitted that she'd been so focused on fitting into Brad's world that she'd lost sight of the values I'd taught her. We've been working on rebuilding our connection, and while it's not the same as it was when she was little, it's becoming something new and potentially even stronger. As for Brad, well, that's been an interesting journey too. The video of that evening went viral, and his law firm was not pleased with the negative publicity. He was required to attend sensitivity training and make a public apology, which he did, though I suspect his motives were more professional than personal. Emily tells me he's been different since then, more careful about his assumptions, and certainly more respectful towards service workers. Whether that represents genuine growth or just better self-preservation, only time will tell. I still work at Danny's 3 days a week, not because I need the money anymore, but because those morning shifts keep me grounded and connected to the community I serve through my legal work. The other waitresses think it's hilarious that customers now sometimes recognize me from the news and ask for legal advice between coffee refills. The most surprising development has been the relationships I've built with some of the wedding guests who approached me afterward. Several have become clients. Others have invited me to speak at their organizations, and a few have even become genuine friends. It turns out that beneath all that social polish, many of them were hungry for authenticity and impressed by someone who'd managed to succeed without losing sight of their roots. Looking back on that evening, I realize it taught me something important about power and respect. For years, I'd allowed other people's assumptions about my worth to make me feel small. I'd accepted that my job defined my value in their eyes, and I'd internalized some of their judgments about what success looked like. But standing in that ballroom with 200 people staring at me in shock, I understood that real power doesn't come from wealth or social status or job titles. It comes from knowing who you are, standing firm in your values, and refusing to let anyone else define your worth. The most powerful revenge I've learned isn't proving your critics wrong. It's living your truth so fully and completely that their opinions become irrelevant. I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I'm facing a particularly challenging legal case, or when someone makes assumptions about what a 62-year-old waitress might be capable of understanding. But instead of feeling hurt or defensive, I smile and remember that people often have no idea who they're really talking to. And you know what? That's perfectly fine with me. Let them underestimate me. Let them assume they know my story based on my uniform, or my address, or my age. Because when the moment comes, when justice needs a voice, or someone needs defending, they'll discover what I learned that night at the country club. Sometimes the most ordinary-looking people are capable of the most extraordinary things. And sometimes the person serving your coffee might just be the one who changes your world. Have you ever been underestimated because of your job or background? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that like button. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more stories about finding strength in unexpected moments, and share this with someone who might need a reminder that their worth isn't defined by others' opinions. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that every person you meet is fighting battles and possessing strengths you might never imagine. Treat everyone with kindness and respect, because you never know who might surprise you.